Hello, good afternoon. This is Manjit Rai speaking. I'm a legal advisor at Lease. We will now be starting this webinar. Please see on screen details about how the audio can be heard. If you experience any technical difficulties, please have a look at the details on screen for how you can get in touch with our IT manager. People are still joining us. I believe we should have everybody with us now. Just to introduce myself again, my name is Manjit Rai, legal advisor for Lease. And the webinar for today is on the right to buy. Just going to read out the disclaimer to you. Whilst we make reasonable efforts to ensure it is accurate and up to date, information and guidance in this webinar does not and is not intended to amount to legal advice in any particular case. No responsibility for any consequence of relying upon the webinar material or presentations of this webinar is assumed by Lease or any of our advisors. The law, as stated during this webinar, is as at the 18th of July 2016, which is today. Again, the Right to Buy webinar is being presented to you now by me, Manjit Rai. Just a brief introduction on the right to buy. The right to buy is the right for a local authority tenant to buy their home at a discount. The tenant would buy the leasehold of their home if it is a flat, and the freehold if the home is a house. In cases where the council has a head lease, then the tenant would buy the leasehold of their house. The right to buy was introduced by the Housing Act 1980 in England, Wales and Scotland for tenants to buy the freehold of their house or to buy a 125-year lease of a flat. The government were committed to giving council tenants the legal right to buy their homes for a discount. When council tenants were first given the right to buy, this was achieved by means of primary legislation in Part 1, Chapter 1 of the Housing Act 1980, which made detailed provision for the scheme by prescribing, amongst other things, the rules stating when the right accrues, how it applies, respectively for freehold and leasehold titles, the rights of joint tenants and family members, how the purchase price and discount are to be fixed, and when the repayment of a discount becomes due upon an early disposal, meaning when the tenant then sells the property on. The most recent change in the statutory right to buy has been in right to buy as a whole right to buy has been extended to tenants of housing association tenants, and we'll have a look at that in greater detail throughout this webinar. The government in England say the right to buy extension is really to reinvigorate tenants' appetite to buy their homes and to promote a generation of homeowners rather than renters. In this webinar, we will be covering England and Wales only. So, what we will cover in this webinar, firstly, we'll have a look at who is eligible to apply for the statutory right to buy and the new prescribed forms that were introduced in England and Wales in 2015. These were as a result of new regulations, which we'll also have a look at in this webinar. If a tenant has tried to apply for the right to buy and their claim is accepted by the local authority landlord, the landlord will send an offer letter to the tenant, and we'll have a look at what should be in that offer letter. There are different discount limits in England and Wales. The approach in England is to promote right to buy and to get tenants on the housing ladder. Wales are phasing out the idea of right to buy, and this was reflected by the decreased discount limit, which they had made available to really make the scheme less attractive. And essentially, Wales are now looking to abolish the right to buy entirely. We'll also have a look at what a tenant can do if their application is turned down by the local authority landlord. An essential part of the conveyance process is to make sure that the lease is correct and the parties know what their rights and responsibilities are. What we will do today is go through some of the key terms implied by statute into right-to-buy leases. So if you are a conveyancer, then to give your clients a reputable service, you should include these into the lease. Having said that, even if they are not included in the lease, these terms are implied by statute. So over the years, the discount level for right to buy and the eligibility criteria has increased and decreased. In the government's manifesto in 2015, the Prime Minister announced a desire to raise the right to buy discount to a level which will make the scheme attractive and to rejuvenate the housing stock. The manifesto contained a commitment to extend the right to buy to housing association tenants to enable more people to buy a home of their own. A voluntary right to buy pilot scheme was introduced and commenced in January 2016 to enable housing associations tenants to enable housing associations to implement the right to buy on a voluntary basis and to really test the scheme out. We'll have a look at the 5 pilot schemes and how the pilot is coming along. Lastly, the Housing and Planning Act, which received royal assent on the 12th of May 2016, we'll have a look at the elements of that which affect the voluntary right to buy. Just a bit of background. As I said, the statutory right to buy was introduced by the 1980 Housing Act, but it was subsequently consolidated and really the major piece of legislation for right to buy is the Housing Act 1985. Which is why I've listed it first on the screen, as it's the main piece of legislation that you will require when dealing with the statutory right to buy. Having said that, there are other pieces of legislation that I've listed on screen that you might want to have a look at your own leisure. The Housing and Building Control Act 1984, this really saw a reduction in the qualifying period to 2 years, and the discount started at 32%, increasing to 60% after a 30-year tenancy. The Housing and Planning Act 1986 governs preserved right to buy, which is the same right to buy, but it applies to housing association tenants to exercise the statutory right to buy if the freehold was transferred from a local authority freeholder to a housing association. The Housing Act 2004 then increased the qualification period for a tenant so that from 2 years to 5 years. So the tenant had to be a secure tenant for 5 years before they were eligible for the right to buy. It also included the discount repayable by a tenant upon the sale of their home. That was extended from 3 to 5 years at a percentage of the market value, regardless of any improvements made by the owner. The Housing Act also gave the landlord rights to refuse the right to buy on certain grounds. For example, if a tenant had an antisocial behaviour order against them. Over the years, the qualification period has increased and decreased, as with the discount levels, in some cases making the scheme unaffordable. The Deregulation Act 2015 received royal assent on the 26th of May 2015, which reduced the qualification period from 5 to 3 years. So as it currently stands, the current qualification period that a secure tenant of a local authority or a tenant of a housing association who has the preserved right to buy is 3 years. Then the Housing and Planning Act intended to legislate the voluntary right to buy, but it does not actually provide for the extension of a statutory right to buy for housing association tenants, because a voluntary deal was struck up between the National Housing Federation and the government. Although the Housing and Planning Act 2016 does make provision for grants to be paid to housing associations to cover the cost of selling their housing assets at a discount. And these grants will be financed through the sale of vacant, higher value, local authority housing stock. So the description of the statutory right to buy is that it is a right granted to a local authority secure tenant to purchase their home at a discount. Again, going back to the Deregulation Act, this applies if they have been a secure tenant for 3 years, as with other criteria which we'll come on to. The 3 years can be accrued through different lengths of residence with different public sector landlords, and the discount will vary according to the length of time they have been a tenant. We'll have a look at the maximum discounts and how they differ for houses and flats a little bit later on. Just to note that the discount is repayable if a relevant disposal is made, meaning if the tenant then sells the home on. So preserved right to buy. A housing association tenant would not usually have the right to buy, although they could have purchased their home under another scheme. The Housing and Planning Act 1986 introduced the preserved right to buy. This is where if a housing association tenant was a secure tenant of a local authority and then became an assured tenant because ownership of the home was transferred to a registered provider, meaning a housing association, then that tenant may have what's called the preserved right to buy. And it only applies if the tenant was living in the home when the property was transferred over. But they can also apply if they then move to another property owned by the landlord. For example, if the tenant has done a home swap with another tenant, then the 3-year period does not have to be in the same property. However, the tenant will lose their preserved right to buy if they move to another property of a different landlord. Previously, only tenants who entered into tenancy agreements before the 15th of January 1989 were secure tenants and had right to buy entitlement. This is because you couldn't create assured tenancies before 1984. A thing to note is that right to buy does not extend to tenants of charitable housing associations. And as mentioned earlier, the right to buy has been extended to all housing association tenants. Although it's not an automatic entitlement for housing associations to buy their home, there are other factors which will need to be considered. For example, different eligibility criteria and exemptions from those set out in the statutory legislation will apply, and individual housing associations will be able to exercise discretion for who they will include and exclude from the voluntary right to buy scheme. So, who is eligible for the statutory right to buy? Well, under Section 119 and Schedule 4 of the Housing Act 1985, these set out who is eligible. And what it says is it's a public sector tenant who will usually be a secure tenant. The home is their only or principal home. It is a self-contained home. It must be a separate dwelling. For example, the home is made up of a number of bedrooms, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a living room, if there is one. But the idea is the home is complete. So there must be no sharing accommodation. For example, no shared kitchen between tenants in the building. The secure tenant will be able to apply either on their own or jointly with up to 3 members of their family that have been living with them jointly for the past 12 months, or anyone that is a joint tenant. In England, the age requirement is to be over 18 years of age, and the family member can be a parent, sibling, spouse, cohabiting couples, even half-blood relatives also count. In Wales, the minimum age requirement is 16 years of age. The definition of a secure tenant is found within sections 79 to 81 of the Housing Act 85. A secure tenant is one that can normally live in the property for the rest of their life, as long as they don't break the conditions of their tenancy. And as mentioned earlier, the Deregulation Act has now changed the qualification period, so the tenant must have lived in the property for 3 years. And they do not have to have lived in the same property for 3 years. It can be made up by numerous tenancies, but only with local authority landlords. So who is not eligible for the statutory right to buy? Well, a tenant will not be eligible if any of the following apply to them. So if they've been made bankrupt or have a bankruptcy petition pending, they've entered into an individual voluntary arrangement with creditors, or there is a possession order in place, or where there is a court order suspending the right to buy, and that's been granted by the court, then the tenant cannot apply for the right to buy. Where there is an application pending for a demolition order or a suspension order or a possession order has been sought on the grounds of antisocial behaviour by that tenant. And really, if the tenant is not using the home as their main or only residence, then they cannot exercise the right to buy. There are also some properties which are exempt from the statutory right to buy if the landlord decides that the property is only suitable for elderly and the tenant doesn't agree to that one, then the tenant can apply to the first-tier tribunal property chamber to, within 56 days of the landlord's notification of the refusal, to really challenge that. Other exempt properties are charitable housing trusts or those properties held by the landlord on a crown tenancy. But really, the list of exempt properties and exemptions are found within Schedule 5 of the Housing Act 85 and Sections 120 and 121 of the Housing Act 1985. A little bit later on, we'll look at how the tenant can challenge the landlord's decision if they don't agree with the refusal. But just having a look at the overview of what suitable occupation of elderly persons means, it's actually set out in paragraph 11 of Schedule 5 of the Housing Act 1985. So a property that has easy access by foot, so let's say there's less than 3 steps leading to the front door and there is a handrail in place, really to help somebody to get into the property, meaning an elderly person. The property is all on one level. For example, it's a ground floor flat or bungalow. If the property is a flat and it's not on the ground floor, but it has 24-hour lift access, that could also be classed as being suitable for occupation by elderly persons. This typical property would not have more than 2 bedrooms and would include heating arrangements, and the property will be reasonably conveniently located for shops and public transport, having regard to the nature of the area. Right to acquire, I'll just briefly go over this one. This is a different scheme. This is one which enables tenants of housing associations to buy their home at a discount. Right to acquire is a statutory right, but it only applies to tenants to buy their homes that were built with social housing grant after the 1st of April 1997, and there's a 2-year qualification period for this. As you'll see later on, you will be able to compare the discount levels, but the scheme for right to acquire, the discounts are much lower. It's 9,000 to 16,000 flat rate discount, and the amount will be dependent on the qualifying years. And the right to acquire is really linked to the property rather than the tenant. But just moving back to the statutory right to buy process, so you can get an overview of that process. On screen, you'll see the overview, but I'm just going to go into a bit of detail on it now. So firstly, a tenant who wishes to apply for the right to buy can make an application called an RTB1 form. This is a prescribed form. Upon receiving the right to buy 1 form, the landlord will carry out eligibility checks within a period of 4 weeks, and they will reply to the tenant using a right to buy 2 response form to confirm or deny that tenant the right to buy. If the tenant is denied the right to buy and they disagree with the landlord's decision, they do have the right to appeal that decision. Okay? If the landlord has accepted that the tenant has the right to buy, then the landlord has a further 8 weeks to send a Section 125 offer notice to the tenant of a house and 12 weeks to send the offer notice to a tenant of a flat. The offer notice will set out what the tenant is being offered. For example, the price of the property based on a valuation that's been carried out, the amount of discount that is available to that tenant, and any structural problems with the property that the landlord is aware of, and the terms and conditions of the sale. Once a tenant receives the offer letter, this Section 125, they will decide on whether they want to accept the offer or not. The tenant does have the right to appeal to a district valuer for a redetermination of the price. This usually happens when the tenant thinks that the valuation price is too high. If the tenant wants a redetermination of the price, they would need to notify the landlord within 3 months of receiving the Section 125 notice. It's important to note that the district valuer's decision will be binding, and there's no way of appealing that. If the tenant is happy to proceed on the basis of the valuation that they've been given and the Section 125 offer, then they will be expected to arrange a mortgage if one is required, unless they're financing it through some other means, or within 12 weeks of the landlord's. They've got to arrange the mortgage within the 12 weeks of the landlord's offer and arrange for a survey or instruct a solicitor. If all goes well, then within 3 months of the Section 125 offer notice, or from when the revaluation has been carried out, then the parties will finalise the paperwork and the sale will be completed. Most of the time, though, sales will go through quickly, although sometimes there might be delays. If the landlord delays the process, it's important to note that sanctions can be imposed upon them. So it's important to get it right. The sanction imposed on the landlord is that the tenant may get a reduction in the price. To get the reduction, the tenant will fill out an initial notice of delay, a right to buy 6 form, and they will send it to the landlord. The landlord must be given at least a month to take the next steps in the sale process. The landlord may send the tenant a counter notice if he has already served them with a response notice or Section 125 notice, or if there is no action that can be taken up by the landlord to speed up the process. If the landlord doesn't send the tenant a counter notice within the allowed time, the tenant can send a further notice called the Operative Notice of Delay, which is an RTB 8 form, and the rent that the tenant pays while the delay goes on will be taken off the purchase price that they have to pay for the home. So it's really important that the landlord does get this right. The Right to Buy 1 form is a prescribed form in England. It's under the Housing Right to Buy Prescribed Forms Amendment England Regulations 2015. This came into force on the 17th of August 2015, and the link to the form is on screen now. This form reflects a change made by the Deregulation Act 2015 of the qualification period being reduced to 3 years. The Right to Buy 1 form for Wales is also a prescribed form, which is set out in the Wales Regulations 2015, and this reflects the reduction in the discount from 16,000 to 8,000, and this is the discount that the tenant would receive for purchasing their home. Well, the reduction really reflects what the government in Wales are trying to do. They're trying to phase out the right to buy in Wales. The reason why the Welsh government want to phase out the right to buy is what they're saying is they want to preserve the publicly owned stock rather than selling it all off. On screen is a quote by the First Minister, Carwyn Jones, on the 28th of June 2016, stating that a bill will be introduced to safeguard Wales's social housing stock by abolishing the right to buy and the right to acquire. This will ensure social housing is available to those who need it and who are unable to access accommodation through home ownership or the private rented sector. Just before this, the Welsh Government had introduced an ability for the Welsh authorities to suspend the right to buy for up to 5 years. And as I understand it, there were about 4 authorities in Wales that had implemented this. But really, Wales are looking to just abolish it entirely. So moving back to the Section 125 offer notice, so assuming that a tenant has made a right to buy 1 application and the landlord has admitted that the tenant has the right to buy, so they're letting them go through with the process, whether the tenant is buying a flat or a house, the landlord will be required to serve on the tenant a offer notice. This is referred to as the Section 125 offer notice, and this sets out many important details about the proposed purchase. So the description of the property must be included, and then it must include the following elements. So how much the property is being offered for at market value, the amount of discount available to the tenant, whether the property is known to have any structural defects, and any terms and conditions attached to the sale. In addition to those details already set out in the previous slide, for a leasehold property, whether it's a leasehold flat or a house, there are many important elements that must be included in the offer notice. The lease will be for a period of 125 years, and this usually starts from when the first flat in the building was sold under the right to buy. The ground rent will not exceed £10 per annum. The value at the relevant time, meaning when the right to buy one form was served on the landlord, that's when that valuation is from. That's the relevant time. Any improvements that have been carried out by the tenant inside the property will be disregarded for the purposes of the valuation, and the tenant must be notified about their right to appeal to the district valuer for a redetermination within 3 months of the notice. The relevant service charges that the landlord wishes to impose on the tenant once they become a leaseholder must also be specified within the Section 125 notice. More contents that will be included in the Section 125 notice. So the notice must specify the reference period, which is a period beginning not more than 6 months after the date that the Section 125 offer notice. The landlord will usually collect the previous 3 years' service charges to estimate what the tenant's service charge contributions will be when they become a leaseholder, and these must be at current prices. The amount of service charge recoverable from the tenant when they become a leaseholder will be capped to what is specified in the notice. So the landlord should specify what service charges they will expect the tenant to be liable for once they become a leaseholder, because errors in the Section 125 notice can prove costly for the landlord. For example, if you omit to put in a service charge or an amount, that can work out to be quite costly for a landlord. So the notice must specify what is payable under each head. The total service charge should be shown, including any planned repairs. And this should be broken down by itemized works that have been estimated. Also, any non-itemized works that have been estimated at an average yearly amount at the current prices for the reference period, meaning that 5-year period. The Section 125 should also include any proposed improvement works and the amounts. All expected details must be shown. The tenant's charge will be capped at what is shown in the Section 125 notice, plus an allowance for inflation. And also, details of the building, any structural defects to the dwelling or the building that are known to the landlord must be shown. So again, if there are things that are omitted from the Section 125 notice, the landlord will find it very difficult trying to recover those, because the tenant, when they become a leaseholder, just won't be liable to pay. So this leads us on to what the current discount limits are. So let's look at England first. In England, the maximum discount available in London is £103,900, and it's £77,900 outside of London. This maximum amount was introduced on the 6th of April 2015 and increases in line with CPI, Consumer Prices Index. You will note that there was no increase applied in April 2016, so the maximum discount remains the same. There are different discount levels for houses and flats, and we'll have a look at those differences. So for a house, the tenant is able to get a 35% discount once they qualify, and it will remain at 35% until they have 5 years public sector tenancy. After the 5 years, the discount will go up by 1% for every extra year that they have been a public sector tenant. Or so it would be up to a maximum of 70% or 77,900 across England and 103,900 in London, whichever is the lower amount. So for flats, the tenant will get a 50% discount for the 3 years qualification period. The discount will remain at 50% until they have the 5 years public sector tenancy. After year 5, the discount goes up by 2% for every year that they have been a public sector tenant, and that's up to a maximum of 70% or 77,900 across England and 103,900 in London, whichever is the lower amount. As I mentioned earlier, the Welsh Government have recently shown that they want to abolish the right to buy in Wales, and really they were looking to phase it out anyway, and this was reflected in the drastic reduction that they put in the RTB1. So the reduction used to be 16,000, but they reduced it to 8,000 for any applications that were made from 14th of July 2015. It looks like that will all be set to change because right to buy will be completely wiped out in Wales. So moving on to what happens if, what can the tenant do if their right to buy offer is turned down. So assuming that the tenant made the application and the landlord turned it down by denying the right to buy, tenants do have the right to appeal. Generally, the right to appeal lays within the county court as set out in Section 181 of the Housing Act 1985. There is only one circumstance within which the tenant can apply to the first-tier tribunal for a determination, and that is when the landlord refuses their application because they think that the home is suitable for elderly persons or suitable for elderly occupation. And in that case, the tenant must apply to the first-tier tribunal property chamber within 56 days of the landlord's notification of refusal. Assuming that the tenant makes the right to buy one application, the landlord admits the right to buy by way of RTB2 response and sends the tenant a Section 125 offer, the tenant should notify the landlord of their intentions about how they wish to proceed, and they should do that within 12 weeks of either receiving the Section 125 offer notice, or if there's been a redetermination of the price, then the tenant should notify the landlord of their intention within 12 weeks from the Section 128, which is a notice informing the tenant of any revised valuation after a redetermination has been carried out. The tenant will inform the landlord of their intentions by way of a Section 125D notice to say whether they accept or withdraw. If the tenant decides not to continue with the right to buy process, they can withdraw the application at any time before they complete the purchase. If the tenant fails to respond using the Section 125D, then the landlord may serve notice on the tenant requiring them to respond. The default notice, the Section 125E, should be served on the tenant, which gives the tenant another 28 days in which to let the landlord know whether they wish to proceed with the right to buy or withdraw their application. If the tenant does not respond by the end of the 28-day notice period, the landlord may cancel the tenant's application and the right to buy will come to an end. So, a right to buy lease, what's in the lease? Well, a right to buy lease will look like any other lease. Then you may notice some differences though. There will be provisions about repayment of discount upon the relevant disposal, right of preemption, and implied covenants about the lessor and lessee's obligations. As advisors here at Lease, we find the most common things that come up are things about the lessor and lessee's obligations in relation to the implied covenants. So that's what we'll be having a look at now. Unlike most other leases, the essential covenants and terms of the lease are implied by statute, and these cannot be varied or changed unless a county court order is obtained. And these important covenants, or these terms, can be found in Part 3 of Schedule 6 of the Housing Act 1985. So let's have a look at some of those implied covenants. So, the ground rent must not exceed £10 per year for the whole term. This is set out in paragraph 11. The lease term is 125 years, and this is set out in paragraph 10. The commencement date for all leases in a building may start on the same date. For example, the day the first flat in the building was sold under the right to buy. So any subsequent sale in that building, their lease will start on the day the first flat in the building was sold under the right to buy. The exception is that if the landlord holds a head lease for an unexpired term of less than 125 years, then they can grant a lease for a term equivalent to that term that the landlord enjoys, less 5 days. So paragraph 13 of Schedule 6 covers common use of premises and facilities. This really enables a tenant to continue to enjoy the facilities that they enjoyed as a tenant. For example, if the tenant had use of a laundry or drying room, that right or enjoyment will be transferred and will be included in the conveyance. So when they become a leaseholder, they will continue to have that right. For any of those who are tuned in now and are listening and are conveyancers, this is a similar provision that's set out in Section 62 of the Law of Property Act 1925, which really covers general words implied in conveyance. So, for those of you who are landlords, really important element is the implied covenant set out in paragraph 14. The landlord covenants, so basically what you as a landlord are responsible for. The landlord is responsible for maintaining the structure, including the guttering and downpipes, and maintaining any parts that the landlord has access to, maintaining the structure and exterior of the building and making good any defects, keeping and repair other property which the leaseholder has rights to use, for example, any communal parts in the building or on the estate. Also, reinstatement, the landlord is responsible for reinstatement of the building in the event of damage or destruction, and maintaining any services enjoyed by the leaseholder to a reasonable level and keep in repair and installation in respect of those services. The legislation does not define what the structure is, so we have to have a look at case law for a workable example. So I've picked this case. This first case is Irvine v. Moran, 1991. It's a Court of Appeal case. the judge considered the external windows and doors would fall within the definition of structural for a residential property. In this case, the windows were sash windows, and it was held that the cords and the sashes and the windows furniture could not be separated from the structure. So basically, structure is anything which is essential to the appearance of the shape and stability of the building. The principles in Irvine was carried through and applied in the case of Sheffield City Council v. Hazel St Clair Oliver, 2007, which went to the upper tribunal, which was the Lands Tribunal at the time, in 2008. The right to buy lease actually provided that the windows and doors were part of the demise and repairable by the leaseholder. The leaseholder said that the windows were demised to her, and so they were her responsibility. So she didn't agree with the landlord saying that they wanted to carry out a window replacement project. But the Lands Tribunal said that in paragraph 14, subsection 2 of part 3 of Schedule 6, which is what we've already looked at, the landlord's obligations, the landlord is under an obligation to maintain the structure of the building. So it was held that the windows were part of the structure and exterior, and it was the landlord's responsibility to replace the windows. So the landlord could carry out the works and recover the costs from the leaseholder. So really, it's essential that if a landlord and a leaseholder or /tenant want to move away from the implied terms set out in the Act, then it's essential to get a consent order from the county court to vary that provision. It won't be enough just to get a deed of variation. So, paragraph 15 deals with the exceptions to paragraph 14, which paragraph 14, as we now know, are the landlord's implied covenants. So the exceptions would apply where the landlord's interest is leasehold. So let's say the immediate landlord has a leasehold interest. They would be required to use their best endeavours to enforce the covenants, but they would not be obliged to comply with paragraph 14 if they are not in the head lease. The leaseholder covenants are found in paragraph 16. So this is really essential for landlords who need to know what they can charge for. Generally, leaseholders are to keep the property in a good state of repair and pay service charges in respect of costs incurred by the landlord for meeting their obligations under paragraph 14. But the leaseholder will not be required to pay more than what is specified in the Section 125 notice within the first 5 years of being a leaseholder plus inflation. Paragraph 19 says that any void provisions that seeks to forfeit the lease where the leaseholder seeks to enforce the provisions of Schedule 6 are void. So it's really important to get legal clarification on what you are putting into your leases if you are a landlord or a tenant exercising the right to buy. So moving on to the right to buy extension in England. So as we know, in the Conservative Manifesto in 2015, the government announced that they wish to extend the right to buy to housing association tenants to enable more people to buy a home of their own. They said it's unfair that people should miss out on a right only enjoyed by local authority tenants. They said that they would fund the replacement of properties sold under the extended right to buy by requiring local authorities to manage their housing assets more efficiently, with the more expensive properties being sold off and replaced as they fall vacant. Following this, it was stated in the Queen's speech on 27th of May 2015 that legislation would be introduced to support home ownership and give housing association tenants the chance to own their own home. This moves us on to the voluntary right to buy. Well, in fact, the right to buy extension has not become statutory obligation because behind the scenes, the National Housing Federation, which is a trade association for housing associations, entered into discussions with government not to legislate on the extension of right to buy to housing associations. Instead, housing associations agreed via the National Housing Federation to sign up to a voluntary agreement. So an agreement was reached between the government and the National Housing Federation to implement the right to buy extension on a voluntary basis. The National Housing Federation's offer was really a compromise with a view to securing independence of housing associations. And it was thought that the first housing association tenants would be able to buy their homes in 2016 under the right to buy extension after the Housing and Planning Bill was given royal assent. So in 2015, there was a Housing and Planning Bill, and the main elements of that bill was, as per the Queen's speech, really to enable the extension of right to buy levels of a discount to housing association tenants, to require local authorities to dispose of their high-value vacant council houses, which would help fund the right to buy extension discounts, and building of more affordable homes in the area. Okay, so during the autumn statement and spending review in 2015, the Chancellor announced that 5 housing associations would pilot the voluntary right to buy scheme for housing association tenants only. The associations who have taken part are on screen now. They're Riverside, Sovereign, L&Q, Thames Valley Housing and Saffron. The voluntary right to buy was intended to be similar to the statutory right to buy, although the voluntary right to buy has been jointly designed by housing associations, the National Housing Federation and government to ensure that the scheme works effectively for tenants, housing association businesses, and to deliver the government manifesto commitment to trial the voluntary right to buy to gauge the demand and test the design. So throughout this pilot scheme, there's been an introduction of a digital-first approach where voluntary right to buy applications can be made online. And reports from the pilot housing associations is that they found it to be a quicker, easier and cheaper process, albeit some tenants who may not use the internet can be excluded by them not being able to gain online applications. But what housing associations said was, the ones that took part in this pilot, is that really in this day and age everybody has access to a computer or knows somebody that does have access to a computer, so it doesn't really exclude anybody. I do understand that throughout the pilot, some are charging an application fee for a tenant who wishes to exercise the right to buy, and that fee is refundable upon purchase. If the tenant aborts the application process, then that fee is not refundable. We were told that the pilot was expected to run until June 2016, which would have been great for us in presenting this webinar, but now we've been told that the pilot is expected to continue to run and a full valuation will be published in September 2016. And it's intended that during the pilot scheme, tenants can only progress up to the point of purchase, but will not be able to complete until the pilot has really been completed. So just moving on, the National Housing Federation estimated that an additional 850,000 tenants would be eligible under the extended right to buy, including those who fall under preserved right to buy and who have not held a tenancy for 3 years. And of those 850,000 tenants, it was estimated that 221,000 would be eligible and be able to afford to buy their homes. But going by the pilot schemes, who say that as of the 3rd of June 2016, they had marketed the voluntary right to buy to 48,000 tenants. 4,000 of those had expressed an interest, but only 478 actually went through with the application process. So for the voluntary right to buy pilot, the eligibility criteria is set out as the following. The tenant must be a tenant of a housing association or a public sector landlord for 10 years or more, and that can be added up by previous tenancies. A tenant has to be one of the housing associations listed in the scheme, in the pilot scheme, and live in a local authority area listed by those in the pilot scheme. There is a presumption that tenants can buy the home in which they live through this voluntary right to buy scheme. This voluntary deal envisages that housing associations will have the discretion to refuse to sell certain properties, and the National Housing Federation have offered a list or examples of circumstances where discretion might be exercised, and these are shown on the screen now. It's important to note, though, that although there is an eligibility criteria and an exemptions list, each individual housing association will have to set up their own policies on the voluntary right to buy, including the criteria and exemptions. If housing associations want to exclude certain properties, they will need to give a clear explanation of why they are excluding certain homes. So the Housing and Planning Bill 2016 received royal assent on the 12th of May 2016. It's now the Housing and Planning Act 2016 and is limited to England only. The relevant chapters 1 and 2, as on screen, these are found in Part 4 of the Act, which is titled Social Housing in England. The Act does not actually contain measures to introduce a statutory right to buy for housing association tenants. It confirms details of how the policy, which is underpinned by a voluntary deal, will work in practice. So Chapter 1, Implementing the Voluntary Right to Buy, Section 64 to 65 empower the Secretary of State, or in London, the Greater London Authority, to make grants to private registered providers, meaning housing associations, in respect of right to buy discounts, basically to cover the discount housing associations give to tenants for buying their home from that provider. And Chapter 2, which is Vacant Higher Value Local Authority Housing, provides a mechanism through which local housing authorities will be required to make payments to the Secretary of State based on selling their higher value social housing, which is expected to become vacant in the year ahead. The presumption is that local authorities will sell these properties. It's expected that these payments will be used to make grants to housing associations in respect of the voluntary right to buy discounts to housing association tenants. The payments will be used to compensate housing associations for selling their housing assets at a discount to tenants. And this will really apply to the local authorities who are required to keep a housing revenue account. essentially, the money that's tied up in the higher value local authority housing stock will be used to fund the housing association voluntary right to buy discounts to fund the supply of more homes. And just lastly, as I said, there's been no sales under this scheme have been completed, and really we can't envisage that there will be until the pilot is completed. We understand that the pilot is continuing and there is continuous evaluation and changes that are being made to the scheme as the pilot goes along. I think things like our understanding is that once these loose ends have been tied up, then the voluntary right to buy will be rolled out nationally to all housing associations. But there's been no implementation date yet for the extended right to buy that's been announced, so watch this space. That's the end of our webinar presentation. I hope you have found that really useful. We do have some time now to go through any questions that you might have or any comments that you would like to make. So I am here if you want to raise any questions. Any questions, please? Any questions? Okay, there's one question. Under the right to buy, if a tenant's family member wants to buy the home for that tenant, can they do that? Well, family members could be eligible to join in on the right to buy with that tenant, but if they're not named on the tenancy agreement, they'll have to have lived in that property for 12 months. I hope that answers your question. Any more questions? Here's a question. Who can we contact for guidance on how to set up our policies and procedures to prepare for the extended right to buy? Okay, I assume that you are working for a housing association and you're not part of the pilot scheme. I would say if you are a National Housing Federation member, you could contact the National Housing Federation for guidance on what the pilot schemes have been doing. And you could even start contacting the other pilot schemes to see what they have been doing. Another question. How will we know when other associations have been included in the pilot schemes? Well, as far as we know, there's only the 5 housing associations who are part of the pilot. I don't think anybody else will be added to the pilot scheme. The intention is that the scheme, the voluntary right to buy, will be rolled out nationally to all housing associations. But until we get a valuation from this pilot scheme that has been carried out, we won't actually know if it's going to apply to every single housing association or not. So we do envisage that we will keep our website updated with anything that comes through. So when we are made aware of what is happening after this pilot has ended, we will publish something on our website. So I would say just keep an eye on the website nearing to September, October time, and then hopefully we might be able to answer your question then. Any more questions? Here's a question. You said that for the voluntary right to buy, the eligibility criteria is 10 years. Why is that? Okay. Well, this is something that was agreed between the 5 housing associations that have taken up as part of the pilot, and they agreed this through the National Housing Federation and government. I hope that answers your question. Another question, could I contact you at a later date with any further inquiries? Yes, of course you can. We at the Leasehold Advisory Service are here to answer any questions that you might have. You can send them in. You should have details. The details are on screen of how you get in touch with us. If you are a professional, there is a charge for the service, but otherwise, if you've got questions now, I can take them away and get back to you with answers if you would wish. But we can have discussions later on, that's fine. You can give us a call on the details on screen and we can discuss in further detail if you've got questions that you can't think of right now. Another question here. So, will the implied covenants that you spoke about be implied into voluntary right to buy leases as well? That's a really good question. Unfortunately, I don't think there's been any details confirmed on that as yet. So we won't know about whether the implied terms within the Housing Act will apply to the voluntary right to buy as well. I would think that they would possibly apply or they would be similar, but because it's voluntary, it's difficult to say really, because there's no legislation, well, the voluntary right to buy hasn't been legislated as such. So, you know, I can't really answer that question, I'm afraid. I think at this point it's too early to say. We were hoping by this point we would know what was happening going forward and be able to give you more of an update on it, but it seems that the pilot has been extended for some time yet, and we just don't know when that will come to an end. Any more questions? Any more questions? Question here. Who gets notified of the district valuer's valuation? Okay. Right, so going back to the statutory right to buy application, if the tenant has not been happy with the valuation that they've been given for the price of their property, and they notify that their landlord that they want a redetermination of the value of their property, that district valuer's valuation will go to the landlord, and the landlord would notify the tenant of the revaluation. I hope that answers your question. Any more questions? I see there's still a few people on screen, so I don't want to just close off yet in case you are writing up a question. So I'll wait. Any more questions? Here's a question. How long should that statutory right to buy process actually last? Well, I suppose each application is different, and really it could last around 9 months from when the tenant submits their application, but taking into account delays, it could take longer. I would just say, as a landlord, I assume that you are a landlord, I would say just ensure that you have strict time frames in place and procedures in place, so that you are sticking to the process and you don't end up with the financial sanction upon you for causing delays. Any more questions? Any more questions, please? As I say, I do hope you found today useful. If you can't think of a question right now, you can contact me afterwards as well. But I'd like to hear from you if you do have any comments, questions, or suggestions. Any more questions, please? Here's a question. Okay, so if a tenant made an application before the 6th of April 2015 but didn't complete, would they be eligible for the increased maximum cash discount? No, they wouldn't. The date that the application is served is the maximum discount they would get. So if an application was made after the 6th of April 2015, if an application was made after that date, they would get the current maximum discounts, which is 103,900 or 77,900 in respect of England. But if the application was made before the 6th of April 2015, I assume there's been lots of delays, which is why it's not been completed, then the maximum discount would be what was the previous maximum discount, and I believe that was something like 77,000 or 102,700. I hope that's answered your question. If that's all for today, I think we could leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you found this session useful. If you've got any comments, I would like to hear from you. Details are on screen on how you can get in touch with us. Thank you very much for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.